All right, so we are now officially in the lab part of the class, which this will be kind of a standard kind of way of organizing things. We'll have like lecture stuff, have a break, do some lab stuff. This is still the first day, so there is still kind of the just getting on our feet here. So we're going to talk about lab stuff. We'll talk about some basic concepts, but we're not actually doing a lab today. But we are going to be together for the next couple of hours still talking about labs. And there's a few other little things from earlier that I wanted to go over as well. I'm going to share screen. Labs. So there are going to be labs. Most classes, there'll be a lab. Again, today is more of an orientation. The first lab where there's actually doing stuff will be the chemistry review lab, which we'll do partly in Zoom on Thursday and partly in person at the College of Marin on next Tuesday, I think it is. So let's take a look here. I can even talk to you all straight before we get into that. A big part of the lab is having hands-on experiences with the concepts in the class. We can talk about, how one kind of compound versus another kind of compound acts in water versus a nonpolar solvent, but there is something really nice about just experiencing it. Or we can talk about an EKG and what this little blip means, what that little blip means. But there's something way cooler when you just stick electrodes on yourself and just see these electrical signals coming off of your skin that are generated by your heart. So part of the lab will be just getting a more hands-on experience of concepts in the class. The other part of the lab is going to be, again, like I mentioned a little bit before, this process of science. Like, what is the process to get the information to actually teach this class and describe how the body works? And again, I think it's important to understand that process, because you're going to constantly be getting information throughout your careers about what is the best approach to be, a person comes in presenting this way, or what's the best treatment for this kind of disease, or blah, blah, blah. And people will have their answers, and it's good to have a critical set of tools to look and decide whether or not, how did they figure that out? Do you respect the way they got their answer? It also I think people sometimes get weirded out by well, how come we used to do it this way and now we do it this way, or the recommendation was this and now the recommendation is that. And realizing that science is a process, it never gets at the truth in the way that tablets from the heavens and gold are this is the truth. It's more here's our information, here's our best understanding and interpretation of this, and it can change as we get more information or new ways of thinking about or synthesizing what we see. The story evolves, which I think is useful for people to also know, because a lot of the things you'll be reading as you go along in your career are going to be studies coming out of labs or something. They're making recommendations, and understanding that process is really useful. And also just understanding for your own self, you're kind of curious and you want to solve something. A lot of these tools are really useful just for, when we get into the details of searching the literature, there's all sorts of publicly available tools to go deep and find out what has been found by kind of more traditional scientific inquiry. And that's also useful to just realize that that's actually pretty easy to dig into once you have a sense of what's out there. Blah, blah, blah. So like our lab on the next 2 days, that chemistry review lab is one of these kind of demonstration labs. We're not going to be like doing and having an objective and a hypothesis and checking out and see if our hypothesis is being supported. We're hopefully going to see what we expect to see. It's supposed to be more about here's an example of what we've been talking about, and so you can see. But other ones in our class are going to be more kind of hypothesis driven. So let me go back. For this entire semester, you are going to be keeping that lab notebook, which we talked about earlier, being that bound, numbered graph paper lab book. You are going to write everything in it. You know, it says here, an important characteristic of the lab notebook, it has all your observations, data, notes, comments, should be complete, concise narrative of your work, readable and understandable. But, you know, you don't want to be so sloppy, I can't read it, but it doesn't have to be beautiful. You know, I can say real lab notebooks aren't beautiful. They're legible, but not beautiful. And if you mess something up, you scratch it out. You actually aren't ever supposed to erase or black something out, because then it's no longer kind of a clear and honest record of your process. So we'll talk more about this. And, you know, what's nice is I'm going to get to see you all in another week, and we can talk a little more detail about kind of the process, or the, you know, the kind of etiquette of doing a lab notebook. This part here, I've added these big eyes here. You know, people often in lab, when they're making observations or recording data, I think because of their experience in, like, you know, 12 years of school up to this point, of wanting to make sure that the thing that is getting graded is perfect. People get horrified by the idea that they're gonna get graded on something that's just kind of more chicken scratchy looking thing, where they're recording what they're seeing in the moment. And in this class, for this particular part of the class, for your lab notebook, it really should be like in person right now. Just write this down. It might not be beautiful, but it's actually what you're seeing as you're writing it. If you take down little scratch paper notes, thinking, well, I will then write it all neatly in there, then it's like that game of telephone. It's like, it's not going to be exactly what you saw in the first place. And you might even lose the strips or forget, what was I doing? So please, as we go through the semester, kind of write things down as you see them, because, you know, then we know that it actually is a record of what you saw, rather than, you know, the other thing that happens is kind of the dry lab thing, where people write down what they think they probably should have seen, which is also not the point. You know, as we do these labs, sometimes things go wrong, and, you know, you'll have to address in your write-up, like, why you didn't get what you expected, but your data should still be what you actually observed, not what you should have seen. And again, I keep changing this. I used to just say, you know, don't collect your data on scratch paper, record it in your notebook. And people would be so terrified of having something sloppy in their book that they would keep doing it. So then I underlined it. Then I put like data in notebook, yes, data, scratch paper, no. And it's still, then I did the eyes, because I read someplace that eyes make people feel guilty. That if you have a candy jar at the office where it says, like, you know, contribute, if you're eating the candy, make sure you put some money in the jar to help support the candy fund. And if you just do that, people tend to eat the candy and not pay anything. But if you have a picture with a big pair of eyes with that thing, people tend to donate a lot more to support the candy fund, because Even if it's just a picture of eyes, they think somebody's watching them. The very first page of your lab notebook at page 1 is going to be the table of contents. So this is going to be just on the very front page. You know, your chemistry lab is probably going to start like on page 3, the next page over. So make sure you have a table of contents in your lab notebook, and don't fill it in ahead of time, right? Because we might change which labs we do or what order we do things or what pages they're on, you never know. So you just have, experiment number, the title of the experiment, and this will be something you create as we go. Write the title, like for next class is going to be chemistry review, what page it's starting on, the date you're doing it. And then as we do the next lab, you'll keep adding to this. Your lab notebook, in addition to being something that is part of your grade, it's like, I think 18% of your grade, it's also going to be a huge ally for you during the lab practical, because the lab practical is an open lab notebook practical. So if you've done a good job of taking notes of what you've done and then writing your discussions of what it means, your lab, and you've got a good table of contents so you can find your stuff easy, this lab notebook is really going to make your life much easier when you're taking the lab exams, the lab practical. So let me go back to the syllabus here. If you look at these labs, some of the labs are just kind of white and some of the labs are purple. The labs that are purple are the ones that have a kind of objective and a hypothesis. They're more of kind of the classic kind of inquiry kind of experiments versus, chemistry review lab or general sensation lab is more about just demonstrating things. But for the labs that are actually this hypothesis-driven thing, you need to come up with what we call a pre-lab. And let me talk about that right now. So this would be, I want to put it in kind of, so this pre-lab, again, you don't need this for the chemistry review lab because the chemistry review lab is just kind of demonstrations. But for the labs that have that purple, that are designed to be more hypothesis driven, you need these 3 things. I'm going to talk about each one in turn. So objective. This is basically, what is the question? What are we asking? What is the point of doing this experiment? This is really not that easy at first, because it really means you have to focus in on what exactly are we trying to answer. But it is one of the most important parts of this whole scientific process, is it has to be kind of clear and concise. If you don't have a clearly stated question, you're going to have trouble ever getting an answer. Like if you ask like, oh, what is the effect of diet on health? It's like, oh my God, where do I start? What aspects of diet, what aspects of health? You really, if you're going to do some experiments or some studies trying to solve some scientific question, you need a really clear and concise question. You could like, what is the effect of dietary fiber on the incidence of colon cancer? that I can answer. That's something that's focused enough that I can actually start having some sense of how am I going to go about answering the question. But if you don't have a well-formed and relatively focused question, you're not even going to know where to start, where to try to, what kind of experiment to design that's going to answer the question in the first place. So we're going to spend quite a bit of our energy making sure that you guys all get good at really focusing in on what is the point of this. This is something I've had students come back after going to nursing school and stuff and talk about how the experience of, getting clear about what's the whole point here? Why are we doing this? Has really helped them, actually made them frustrated with other people around them who are like, aren't getting like, what's the whole point here? Like it's a useful, it might seem like, especially in the beginning, like usually people start writing objectives and I'll give them feedback saying this is okay, but we need to change it. And it can be a little bit of an iterative process. Typically, it's like, how does an independent variable affect some dependent variable? Which means we need to spend a little bit of time talking about independent and dependent variables. Most of our experiments, the independent variable, this is the thing you try different values of. The dependent value, you look at this and see if it changes in any predictable way. Fiber versus colon cancer. My question was, how does the intake of dietary fiber affect the incidence of colon cancer? What would be an independent variable versus a dependent variable there?
Like the amount of fiber you're consuming?
Is which one?
The independent?
Exactly. So independent variable, we're trying different amounts, seeing different amounts of fiber consumption. And the dependent variable, let's look at incidence of colon cancer, and then we can look to see, is there a relationship between those two? An objective there would just be, what is the effect of dietary intake of fiber on incidence of colon cancer? That would be a nice objective. The first lab we're going to do that's actually this kind of a thing is going to be the jumping lab. We're basically going to measure different body measurements, like people's height and their calf circumference and their weight. And then we're going to have them jump. They're actually going to, and this one we're not going to do in person, even though it's fun, just because I was trying to limit how many in-person things we have. But so people jump off the ground as high as they can. And then we try to see, is there a relationship between their height or their weight and how high they can jump? What would be the independent and dependent variable in that kind of experiment?
Would the independent be the height and weight?
Exactly. There that we actually have two independent variables. We're looking at different values of height, different values of weight. And then the dependent variable would be
the height, how high you can jump.
Exactly, the height of the jump. So we can look at the height of the jump and see if it seems to be correlated or related to the independent variables. So that's the basic idea. Independent, dependent, and they can relate different ways. You can have like a classic one I like to bring up is cups of coffee versus test scores. So we could have, let's say this is exam 1 score, and this is going to be, average cups of coffee per day. And I want to look and see, and so we look at, I'm just looking at my screen. There's Jean. Jean drinks about 2 cups per coffee and she got that score. And somebody else, Liz, doesn't drink any coffee at all and got that score. Or no, actually, no coffee at all would be over here. We could put all of our people, like, x-axis is going to be how many average cups of coffee per day. Y-axis exam score. I put all of these people here on my graph. I get something like this. And then I can try to see, is there a relationship? Is there some kind of a correlation? And in this case, it's a little loosey-goosey, but I would say, in general, there seems to be like the more cups of coffee in general, people tended to do better on the exam. What would I call that kind of a correlation? If one variable goes up, the other variable also goes up.
Positive correlation?
Yeah, that would be a positive correlation. Or also called a direct correlation, because they're both going up the same way. It could be just as likely I have something like that, that I could have a negative correlation or an inverse. That happens as well. It's still a relationship, but it means as one goes up, the other one goes down. Another possibility that's actually frustratingly common is something more like this. It's just all over the map. And when you look for what's the best fit line, it's just doesn't seem to make a difference how many cups of coffee they had when you look at the exam score. What would we call that?
That T word, the T-O-lot, no?
I just call it like uncorrelated. There might be a T word as well that I bet it's not coming to me right away. Right, so the question would be, is there a relationship between cups of coffee per day versus exam score? You would do the experiment, right? So first we have an objective. What is the relationship between average cups of coffee per day and exam scores? And then we do the experiment. We actually just look at the data and we can see, what does the data support? Does it support like coffee helps people, it hurts people, it doesn't seem to have much of an effect. While we're here, we should bring in the idea of correlation does not imply causality. Let me write that more formally so we exclamation mark. So this is, for instance, we're looking here. We do the experiment. It's like, wow, the people who were drinking more coffee did better on the exam. So it sure looks like we should recommend people drink more coffee if they want to do better on their tests. But that doesn't mean that the coffee was actually the cause of doing better on the test. It just means there was a correlation between how much coffee per day and how they did. But the explanation, when we go deeper, might be very different. It might be what's really important is kind of study time and working together in study groups. And the people who were in study groups tended to meet at cafes, and then they felt guilty about sitting in the cafe all day, so they bought more coffee to, like, keep the business afloat. So the people who did well on the exams did drink more coffee per day, but that wasn't the most important reason why they were doing better on exams. It was actually because they were in their study groups and studying more. So you have to be super careful, just because, the classic things like, everybody that's like ever like become an astronaut has eaten white bread in their life. And it's like, white bread has nothing to do with being an astronaut. It's like, it just happens to be, yeah, they're correlated. Everybody who ate bread did end up being whatever, but be careful about getting too sucked into like, it must be related.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So would that be like a cut and dry limitation of science, that you can never have causality? Or is there a point at which you can say this causes that?
Right. I think it depends also on your kind of theoretical framework. Like here, let me try to think about that. You could definitely say something can't happen without something else. But yeah, I would say that's probably part of the limitations. That being said, sometimes we have a pretty good idea about what's causing something else. And then you do like other control experiments, as much as possible. In fact, we're going to talk about that right now. Sources of variability. Like, one of the things you do when you're designing an experiment is you brainstorm as much as possible. What are all the things that might be affecting my dependent variable other than the things I'm looking at? And then as much as possible, try to control for those and take them out of the equation. So yeah, then Sienna, you'd feel more confident that your independent variables are actually the thing that's important. But there have been really interesting experiments. There was one where they were looking at low light in the house or light in the house at night versus incidence of needing to wear glasses and things like that. And there was even, like, theoretically, we kind of evolved, without lots of little night lights everywhere. And maybe there's something developmentally about having night lights all over the house that actually messes up our ability to have our vision develop. And they found a correlation that houses that had more night lights, the kids were more likely to be wearing glasses. And they felt pretty convinced, at first, that this was supporting that the night lights inhibited the normal development of vision. And what they ended up was, they looked deeper, they realized a big part of your visual acuity is just genetic. And they found more that parents whose vision wasn't as good tended to have more night lights on around the house, and their kids tended to have worse vision, but just because of their genes, not because of the night lights around the house. So you got to be really careful. So it is possible to get what's the right word? To think you seeing something important when, in fact, if you look deeper, it's actually not quite what you thought. Yeah, so in fact, if we go back, so this objective is just the, basically, is there a correlation between the independent variable and the dependent variable? That's basically a well-formed objective should sound very similar. Is there a correlation between somebody's height or weight and how high they can vertically jump? Done. Is there a correlation between average cups of coffee per day consumed and performance on physiology exam? Done. It should be very clean. Just what is the independent variable you're going to be looking at? What is the dependent variable? And our question is there some kind of correlation or relationship between the two? Again, sources of variability you want to think of at this part of the process as well. For this, the more and more you can try to control for them, the less you're going to have that worry that what you're seeing is not having to do with your variables. Like for the jumping lab, like what would be sources of variability in this jumping lab where we're, again, measuring their height and their weight and seeing how high they can jump vertically?
The height and weight, right, would be the sources of variability.
Those are going to be the independent variables. So those are the things we actually are kind of controlling for and measuring. So we want, like, what are the things other than the specific independent and dependent variables that actually might actually be affecting our results, even though we're not looking at them explicitly?
Maybe like what shoes you're wearing.
Totally.
Like if you're wearing high heels, you're probably,
Yes.
maybe might not be able to jump as well.
I would say not even maybe. That's almost for sure. If you're wearing like your basketball shoes versus stilettos or something, it's going to make a huge difference on how well you can jump. Or you're wearing flip-flops or something. So that would be a source of variability. And you really want to think of this ahead of time before you design an experiment, so you can kind of get it out of the equation as much as possible. Like for the jumping lab, in the methods, we say specifically, take off your shoes. Everybody's jumping either barefoot or socks. So therefore we know that this source of variability is not going to be confounding our results. What would be another source of variability for this kind of jumping lab?
Gender?
Say it again.
Gender?
Gender could be. So
Their hair.
Say that?
Their hair.
Here, what about
like how their hair is done, like the height, right? Because then, you're measuring from the ground up. Never mind.
So the actual ground that you're jumping from, maybe.
Yeah, the type. Yeah, I mean, if you've ever done gymnastics, if you're jumping on a spring floor versus on linoleum, it's huge. Even the mechanics of the jump. Again, if you've done more gymnastic stuff, you can do all sorts of different kinds of lifts and this and that. The mechanics of a jump completely changes how high you jump. So like in this lab, we also have a very specific description of the mechanics of the jump. So as much as possible to get that out of your source of variability.
What
hair.
about athleticism of the individual? Is that a source of variability?
That would be a source of variability. It's for some of the things we kind of hope that they kind of average out. Like for instance, for that, you're gonna, let's say there's let's say the perfect answer is something like that. But some people who are more athletic are higher, some people are less athletic. You kind of hope if there is some variable that's not controlled, that it will kind of cancel itself out, because you'll have as many people who are maybe jumping a little better than average because they've got more training or athleticism versus people who jump a little lower than normal because they're not, but that's not a given. Ideally, if we were answering this question, we probably would want to get more information about that. But sometimes you can't control for things, like sleep. We're not going to control for how well rested everybody is, and we're going to just kind of hope that there's as many, many people are feeling a little extra jumpy and other versus the people feeling a little more sluggish, that they kind of cancel each other out. But it's not, you don't know for sure. So anyways, just bringing up, we'll talk more about this later, but the idea of sources of variability is important. And before each of these experiments, I will have you kind of think about them and write them out specifically. It's just like a list. That doesn't have to be a big essay. It's just like a little list of things that might affect your results. Because if you do it afterwards, you might have to throw out all your data, right? This has actually happened. I did, this was on my first sabbaticals, doing binocular rivalry experiments collaborating at Berkeley. And it was started getting back all, this task where you like you look at this stuff and you see different things with the different eyes, and you have to hit buttons depending on what you actually see. And the first results started coming back, you know, and it really didn't make sense. And I looked deeper, and at some point I realized a source of variability was like really understanding the task well. And it turns out that the people were not really understanding exactly what they were supposed to do. You know, and I had to add an extra part to the experiment where there's a longer training period. And then I was able to get good data, but I had to throw out tons of data because there was this source of variability that I did not take into account, thinking like, oh, I just explain it and then go. And instead it was, you know, actually we needed a much more explicit way of explaining and testing and making sure that the task was well explained. So source of variability. Hypothesis. This is kind of your educated guess. So guess because you don't know the answer. There's no reason to do the experiment if you know the answer, right? You wouldn't have to do the experiment if you knew what the answer was going to be definitively. So this is your guess of what you think you're going to find. Educated meaning there's a reason. You can't just kind of pull it out of your butt. You got to have some actual reason why you think this is what you're going to see. Reason. Like for the jumping lab, what would be a reasonable hypothesis for, if my question is how does somebody's height and or weight affect their ability to jump vertically? What would be a possible hypothesis?
Potentially, the more they weigh, the more muscle they may have, or it could be vice versa.
Right. So exactly. So you notice you can have the same, or you can have opposite hypotheses that are both correct. It could be someone that weighs more will have more muscle mass and therefore be able to, you know, generate more force against gravity and jump higher. Or people who weigh more are going to have to fight gravity more and are likely to not jump as high, so they'll have lower jumps. There'll be an inverse correlation. Either of those would be a fine and correct hypothesis because it has a prediction about the relationship between the variables and it's got a reason, you know, that is reasonable. Right. So just kind of putting that out there, I think because people get uncomfortable, like what is the right answer? You know, for a hypothesis, it's a guess. You know, you can get it. You can have a bad hypothesis if you just say, I think heavier people will jump higher, and then don't tell me why. You need to have the why. But it might not end up being what you end up finding. In fact, it's very common to do experiments and find out your hypotheses are not supported. So I'm noticing that I haven't been following the chat. I just noticed there's stuff going on. Yeah, and if people have questions, it's actually awesome that people are answering each other's questions. And if people feel free to stop me as well. So if you have questions about things. In fact, it might make sense to just do a little thing, a breakout room thing right now with independent, dependent variables, because we're going to be doing this a bunch throughout the semester, is making sure that you guys can pick out what is an independent and dependent variable. What are sources of variability? What are hypotheses? And it's not, in the beginning, it's not always so obvious. If you've been doing this for a while, you'll be good at it. But in the beginning, it can be a little tricky trying to figure out what's the independent, what's the dependent. I'm going to go back to modules here. I'm going to share. let's see. So if you go on to, if those of you who are in the class will be able to find this. If you're still on the wait list, you're not going to be able to get into this, but I'm going to show it on the screen so you'll see it that way as well. Here under Lab 0 orientation, I just added this thing here, independent dependent variables, 0 points. It's not worth anything. This is just to try to get you guys thinking about this stuff. So this was something that came out a couple of, actually just like a year and a half ago. I think particularly relevant to like life in college. Alcohol-related hangover symptoms, nausea, headache, stress, anxiety, how it's affected by this L-cysteine containing vitamin supplement. So abstract is just kind of in a nutshell about what the study was about. And what I want people to do is read this thing. It's basically within this thing, it kind of includes the objective as well as the results, what they actually found, and you can figure out what the independent variables or dependent variables are. So we're gonna go, I'm gonna throw you all into breakout rooms. What I would like people to do in their groups is just answer these 4 questions. We're going to just do this for like 10 minutes and then we'll come back and make sure that everybody's kind of on the right page. But as you're doing this, as much as possible, don't just let one person, I know sometimes the dynamics get kind of like person grabs the bull by the horns and just, I got this, and everyone else gets kind of dragged along for the ride. As much as possible, let it be kind of a conversation. Make sure you reach a consensus. Like if not everybody understands or agrees with what the independent or dependent variable is, continue the conversation and kind of try to explain to each other what you're thinking and why that makes sense. Ideally, I would like each person in your little breakout room to reach a consensus on each of these 4 questions. And again, this is where, the people who are more familiar with this stuff can really help, explain it to the people who are not as familiar with it. All right, I need to, where's my little thing? There it is. I'm gonna go into breakout rooms. Is everybody clear what you're about to do? You could write it down on a piece of paper where you're at, or you could, I have this set up so you can actually just click on this thing and submit it as a text box as well. Either way, you're not getting graded on it, so it doesn't matter, but it would be nice to actually see you type something in, because that way I can give you feedback if it seems you're kind of lost.
So we need to pull this up on our end as well, correct?
Yes. Yeah. If you pull this up on your end, you should be able to click through to it as an assignment. It should be on Canvas. And again, if you are on the wait list, you're not going to be able to do it. So just write it on paper. It'll be fine. All right, I'm going into breakout rooms. Kind of fun seeing everybody come back. Okie dokie. So I've talked to a few people. So how about someone from another group want to share? Someone want to share what they came up with the independent variable for our little study here?
Okay, I'll go.
Okay.
Is it the L-cysteine?
Yeah, exactly. Right. The thing that is being manipulated by the experimenters is whether or not the subjects are being given this amino acid. Right. If you wanted to be a little more specific, you could say like, ingestion of 600 or 1200 mgs of L-cysteine. But at the core of it, it's, what is, L-cysteine is a thing that's either being given or not? And how about the dependent? Somebody else for the dependent variable.
The alcohol or acetaldehyde related effects.
Yeah, exactly. And it's if we wanted to get more specific there, what were the specific ones that they actually even mentioned?
Nausea, headache, stress, and anxiety.
Yeah, exactly. So there are our dependent variables that we can then now put it all together. What would be the, in a nutshell, the objective, the question that they're asking with this whole study?
To see if taking L-cysteine would reduce the symptoms of a hangover.
Yeah, reduce, or just what is the effect? I mean, the reduce would be getting to the hypothesis. They're assuming something's going to happen. But at the core thing is there a relationship, a correlation between cysteine and these different alcohol-related or hangover symptoms, specifically nausea, headache, stress, and anxiety. So hopefully this is kind of giving you a sense, like I've mentioned to some other people, we're going to be doing this, kind of ongoing, working on getting you all comfortable, kind of teasing apart. What is the core question here? What are the important variables that are being manipulated or measured?
I did. And then I realized what time it was.
Jean, were you talking to me or oh, she's on? Okay. Are there any questions about this? All right, so definitely the idea of independent dependent variable is going to be ongoing theme for 4 months. So if it's something that you're realizing you're still a little like not quite sure about, if you can put that on like your little list of things to like, make sure that you start getting more comfortable with. There will be certain things in the class that we'll mention and that we'll kind of move on from. And then other things like independent dependent variable that we're mentioning now and is gonna be coming along for the ride till the last day of class.
Are there some more of these that maybe you can post just for, I don't know, just for fun, but like just for our practice, maybe just in the module?
Yeah, so I have some that I was planning to do kind of similar to this, but we can also probably try to find some more of that kind of stuff as well.
Okay, thank you.
Or I might maybe Google and just find, a lot of times this kind of thing exists as something already somebody else has made. Although be careful. Not everything out there is good, but there's a lot. Yeah, you got to be what's the right word? Sophisticated consumer of like educational supplemental information as well, because sometimes people post stuff trying to be helpful, but they're not actually helping. They're actually, but some of the stuff that's posted out there is great. And I'll do my best to try to connect you with resources that I think are cool. All right, let's continue here. Where we are, we're at 12:20. Want to just mention some, the idea of statistics. We are not doing a lot of formal statistics in this class. However, you have to understand the basics of what it means or why we actually care. And basically, the world is very random. There's a lot of randomness. I cannot, let me make that prettier. With the jumping lab, for instance, we want to see how their height or their weight affects their ability to jump. So if you have some random person jump up and measure like how high did they jump, whatever this distance is. The fact is, if they jumped again, it probably wouldn't be the exact same height, even if they still jumped with all their strength. You know, they jumped, it's like even trying to measure like, well, we're trying to correlate people's height and weight with how high they can jump. How can you even measure how high they can jump? Because every time they try to do their best jump, it's probably like a little different. Right, so how do we get around that? If I actually want my dependent variable to be the height that this person jumps, and yet every time they jump, it's actually a little different, what do I do there?
Find the average, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. So we have what are called measures of central tendency. So yes, the data is kind of scattered around, but it's what is the average? I mean, in fact, mean average is the way we're going to do it. Right, the mean average, which is basically just, that's interesting. People keep coming in and out and in and out. I'm trying to figure out what's going on. So this is going to be a really common thing in this class where we take a measurement, but we don't just take one measurement and stop. We'll take a few measurements and we'll do the average and hope that that average is kind of closer to the true value, because that randomness is keeping us from ever really measuring the true value. What's that? I thought someone said something. And how do you calculate mean average?
Add it up and then divide by how many you have, how many you're.
Exactly. You just add all the values and divide by the number of subjects or number of numbers. There's other averages, right? You can get median, like the median home price in Marin. That's actually like half the numbers are above or half the numbers are below this median average. There's different kinds of average. We're going to do the mean average. The other thing that we pay attention to is how spread out things are around that measure of central tendency, how spread out they are around the mean. So measures of dispersion. So like for instance, let's say I'm doing like this is average test score. Actually, no, this is test score. This is people who drink coffee. This is people who don't drink coffee. And I can say, let me do color. Let's say it looks something like this. Let's say this is average test score. Let's say this is 85. Let's say this is like 83. This goes up to 100 and whatever. So someone could look at this and say, okay, on average, the people who drink coffee seem to do better on the test than the people who don't drink coffee. And that's one piece of information. But the other piece of information you really would like to know is how much do these averages really represent the data that I measured? So this measure of dispersion, one thing you can do is just like the range of the data. It could be, if I look at the actual scores that I averaged, they were all over from here to here, and the average happened to be right there. And if I look at the non-coffee people, it might be the same thing, a huge range of data, and the average happened to be a little lower, but I don't really trust that these two averages are really that meaningful at all, because the reality is the data was non-coffee and coffee drinkers were all over the map, did great, did bad. And when we averaged them, they just happened to be a little different like this.
Are outliers something that we take into account when we are doing graphs like this, or?
It's a tricky thing. Outliers, if you're being completely kind of honest with things, you should just count every piece of data. Then you can reanalyze for outliers, particularly if you have some reason why you think it's responsible to get rid of an outlier. But you don't want to throw out something just because it's not what you were thinking or you think should happen. So you have to be careful with that. Right, if I looked at the same data and all of the range of the data was really tight around these means, then I could say, this likely is a real effect. Right, so by looking at how spread out the data is versus how kind of tight it is, it gives you a sense of how much you actually trust that this difference is meaningful. What are other things? Other things. Okay, I'll bring this up. I'll bring this up later as well, but I think this is a useful concept to think about. Like I mentioned a little earlier, science doesn't give you like truth with a capital T. It gives you like, this is our best, our best prediction based on this empirical data and what we know about statistics and stuff. I could do this experiment. I measure, these are different, it's a certain spread. I do my statistical calculations to say how likely is it that this difference is real and not just due to the randomness in the world. I could have just picked the wrong people for this and just, these people just never do that well, even no matter what they are taking. And these people could be like, so you don't know that what you're seeing is real versus something that's just due to randomness. The more subjects you get, the wider apart these two means are from each other. If you're looking at something where you've got two groups that are really separated and the range of the data around them, or if we're doing more classical statistics, would be like the standard deviation. If, here I would trust like, wow, these coffee drinkers versus non-coffee drinkers, it really seems like there's a difference and I can trust it because the data is really kind of dramatic, but you calculate statistics and they tell you the confidence. Your confidence that this difference that you see in these exam scores is real and not just due to the randomness of the world. And this is where it gets tricky because there is a convention right now that if you have 95% confidence as calculated through these different statistics that we're not going to go into detail with so much, that you can go publish in a paper saying, it seems likely there's a statistically significant effect of coffee on doing better on exam scores. This 95% is kind of something that people have settled on, but there's two things to think about with that. This is saying that 19 out of 20 probability that this is real. It means that there's a 1 out of 20 that you've made a mistake. There are like two kinds of mistakes people make. There's type 1 and type 2 errors. You can say there's an effect when there's not. You can say the other type of error, you can say that I don't think there is an effect when there actually was an effect, because you do this and these are pretty close, or the randomness is just swamping out the real effect. But realizing when you look at something in a scientific paper, this is the minimal. Sometimes people publish things and it's much higher confidence, but there is stuff that's published that's about this confidence. People have started looking at this with a little more of a critical eye and thinking maybe this is a little loose, because they've actually gone back and tried to like recreate some kind of seminal studies and stuff and find that it doesn't always work out the way they think or that they hoped. So people, it's actually been one of the kind of soul searching in science more recently, is being a little more rigorous in terms of trying to decide statistically, due to this randomness, whether or not you can say that this is real or not real. So we'll come back to this, but I think it's worth kind of putting that out right now, that, you know, part of this process tells you likelihoods, but it's, you know, things, you know, it can be tricky trying to figure out what is really real. What else? So any questions about that? Again, in this class, you're not going to have to calculate this in general. We'll probably do one formal calculation just as a class to kind of just show you how it looks. But I think it's important, you know, at least understanding this idea that, you know, science is a way of having, you know, kind of information that you can trust, but not infallible. Reliable, but not infallible. That's like the kind of term people often use. All right. I'm looking. Objective. Last things. I'm going to whoa, we need to go into here and to here. This is some stuff that I realized before I kind of say goodbye. Time management tools. This is for you to look at if you want. This is something Tina Christensen, with the other instructors, came up with, but I think it's kind of useful. Like, especially if you're not as used to doing a more rigorous class like this, people get really surprised at how much time it takes. And then you just in the back of your mind thinking you're going to fit it in someplace. I do this all the time. I have this to do, that to do, that to do. And somehow I'm just thinking about them all as independent things, and then get in a lot of trouble because I realize if you actually look at them all together at the same time, it's more time than you actually have in your life to actually do it all. So it's worth putting in a little bit of energy. You know, again, use these if they're useful, don't use them if you don't need them, but it's worth thinking about what, you know, I'm assuming that this isn't your only class, or if it is, that you have other things in life and you work, or you're a parent, or you've got other responsibilities. So kind of thinking about how much time the class is going to take, how much time other things are going to take, and, you know, actually kind of scheduling things into some degree is not a bad idea. Because I do find people sometimes are not used to kind of time management. So it's worth kind of explicitly saying, like, part of succeeding in this class is dealing with time management. So just kind of putting that out there. What else? Other things. Chemistry check-in. I saw about half of the people have done this quiz. If you haven't done it, make sure you please do it before Thursday. Again, it says 11 points, but it's not graded. It doesn't count for your overall grade, but I would like to see where you're at. I mean, I've been looking at some of them that people have done. It's pretty clear that there's quite a bit of chemistry people are going to have to review. as we start.
What about those of us who are waitlisted?
So then you're just gonna, once if you get in, you'll be able to get it. So unfortunately, you'll have to just wait there.
You said it's due Thursday?
Yeah, I would like you to have it done before Thursday. So as we really dig into chemistry, I have a sense of where people are at, and also everybody has had a chance to like look at these things and maybe get, if they're reading questions and saying, wait, I have no idea, you can kind of go back. I have some, where is it? Curated chemistry. It has a silly name because we had these classes a year ago where we had to create curated content for a Canvas course. So I was like, okay, here's my curated content. But these are things that you don't have to read all of them or watch their videos. But if you are trying to remember ionic versus covalent, polar versus nonpolar, you do need to know these concepts. You need to know them well. They're going to be at the core of everything. So I have these are ones, at least like I haven't looked at them like yesterday, but 6 months ago, these were like good. This crash course guy is pretty funny. So the basic idea of different kinds of bonds, polar versus nonpolar, how units and sig figs work is also important for a class. Idea of equilibriums, solutions, pH, buffers. These are all concepts that we are going to be using in our class. So if you are thinking like, oh, I could use a little review on these, these are all things that you can click through from the Canvas portal and look at. And again, this guy is pretty funny. He's like, this is the crash course guy. Yeah, once I had students who like told me about him at first and they liked him, and I checked him out and he seems pretty solid.
Like chemicals are really all about bonds. Think about all the relationships in your life. You're a casual acquaintance to some people, a colleague or friend to others.
Right, so he's hilarious. So you don't have to worry it's going to be super dry talking about this bond. It might make you giggle while you're going, remembering this stuff. What else? Yeah, the last thing I will mention is next class, we are going to do this first lab, start the lab, which is the chemistry review lab. There is no pre-lab or anything you need to do for it, but it would be a good idea to read through the lab. So don't worry about writing down anything. There's nothing you have to do in advance for Thursday's lab, but you should have a sense of what's in store. So that's what I would say. Like, and again, if I go into modules, and again, I'm cleaning all this stuff up right now, but sometime later today, this chemistry review lab will be published. And minimally, if you don't have that's actually the wrong one there. I usually have a PDF of the thing there as well you can look at. If you are on the wait list, email me and I'll just send you a PDF of the pre-lab or of the lab thing so you can read it in ahead of time without having, hopefully you probably haven't bought the lab manual and stuff yet. So are there any questions about any of this stuff?
I have one about the Scantrons for our exams. Do we need to get that through the bookstore? I've never had to buy a Scantron.
I mean, that's where usually you buy them. You could probably get them on Amazon. You could probably get anything on Amazon. They usually come in packs. Like if you buy 6 at once, they're cheaper than if you buy 1 at a time.
You want the big ones, right?
Yeah, the big ones that have 50 questions on each side. Yeah, so the Scantron, and you're not going to need a Scantron for like a month. So you've got some time before that happens. And what else? The book issue, again, is so strange. Again, if you bought the book that the bookstore had. It's a good book. And if you like it and you've got the resources to hold on to it, it's a good book. I like the Sherwood book. Again, the other option is this one, which, hold on. Now my system is getting all weird. Hold on.
I mean, the syllabus that you have posted is based off of the book you have in your hands right now, right?
Correct.
Okay.
But it's easy to find. You just look up in the chapter table of contents and you can find whatever.
Okay, so it's not necessary that I have the other book, right? Because,
absolutely not.
Okay, because I've read that other book, like I used it because I've done physiology before and I dropped it, but I'm hoping that this book might be better for me.
Right. No, like I said, I kind of like the Sherwood book because it's a little more kind of laid out in a linear fashion. The Silverthorne book, I think like she tries to really kind of show how, like in our lecture, we're going to be talking about signaling, signal transduction and all that right in the beginning. And she gets into that in the beginning and starts pulling you into the endocrine system and things where I think it's better to kind of build up to where you're into the endocrine system rather than just dive head first into there without having a sense of all the other systems in the body. But that being said, she does a good job, and it's free. That's what I would say. If the book wasn't free for you all, I would have stayed with the Sherwood. But given that this book is fine and you don't have to pay for it, I was like, why not? So, what else? I think I sent the thing out how to pick up the book. I sent that out. So hopefully if you have any trouble with that, let me know. I will also see, maybe I'll get one of the librarians to do a little Zoom bomb on Thursday and can talk about the book as well as other resources. The library is a good resource for lots of things. Like you're going to be doing your research project, that's what they do best, is help people figure out how to do research and utilize the resources available to them. So, and right, because part of this research project is going to be writing. You are going to be graded on being able to write something that I can understand. And they have all the online writing workshops and things like that, or online writing center. So there's lots of options for you guys as the semester goes on to get help to the library as well. All right. Yeah, I think, this is always, the first day particularly always feels like I talk way too much. So I think I'm going to stop talking and just, what do they say? Strike the set, call it a wrap. And
I have one more question. I'm sorry, before we end.
No problem.
So as far as like what we should have ready for class on Thursday, you said we should read through the first lab that we're going to do. Yeah. And then we should also read, like, I'm looking just off of the syllabus, like go through chapters 1 and 2, it looks like.
Is that, let me take a look. I've got my thing right here. I think, chapter 1 and 2 sounds about right, because that's kind of the chemistry.
Oh, and then we should just be like checking in to see for the modules to like see if you post anything else on there that we need to have done by Thursday.
There won't be anything new for you.
Okay, so just go through everything that's already on there. Yeah,
what you're gonna see is just things starting to get cleaned up and looking more normal. Okay. But no, there's not, I'm not going to give you a surprise assignment between now and Thursday. Okay. So basically, if you haven't done that chemistry review quiz, which is already there, you should do that. And again, if you're going into it and realizing you're not doing well, that should be a kind of motivation to kind of review some of the chemistry. at this point, it doesn't matter. If I'm assuming a lot of people see something and then forget it, that happens, but you have to be able to kind of bring it back up. And then as you learn it in a deeper context, hopefully it'll become more and more something that you got more of an intuition for.
Would you want us to go over those PowerPoint slides as well? Just like the first one, or because there's like the Silverthorn PowerPoint presentation.
Oh, so those, okay, I can mention those real briefly. Where did I put them? I put them right here. Yeah, so let me share that just so you can see what I'm talking about, what she's talking. So here under Remote Lecture Leak 1, it says Silverthorn PowerPoint presentations for first unit. I have each of the chapters. During the lectures, sometimes I will use some of the images from here. And so this way, I didn't use any of them today. I might use the molecules PowerPoint. I might use some of the pictures there in part of the lecture to show what a carbohydrate looks like versus a lipid or something. And you can just always come here and have access to any of the images that show up. These are not necessarily going to be integrated into the lecture beyond like kind of random things, but I figure they're useful for you guys to have access to. So don't use this as a, like, we need to make sure we look through these, but these are just going to be the images from the book. That's all they are. Okay. Other questions or anything?
You may have said, can you hear me?
Yeah. Wait, now I can't. Now you're frozen in a very like interesting pose. You look like, yeah, you look intense right now. I can't hear you now. So what's your question? Oh, now you look less intense.
Good. Just whether, was there a preference for pencil or pen in the lab notebook?
Yes, so there's a major preference for pen because remember, it's supposed to be this kind of permanent record. So there's no erasing. I'll talk about this more when we get into lab in person, but the basic idea is you write in pen. If you make a mistake, you kind of line it out. Real lab books have all sorts of scribbles in them. This, and they're not super pretty. Like this is a genuine lab book. This is a lab book of like, my own personal lab book, I scrape things out because I write something and then it's like, oh wait, that's not what I meant, or I have to revisit something and change it. So they have to be legible, but they don't have to be super pretty. Again, you can scrape across this stupid thing. I'm just trying to show that there's things crossed out. And I'll bring in, when I'm actually on campus, I have all sorts of lab books that I can just throw out on the table that you can look through and get a sense also what they tend to look like. That's one of the weird things also about doing this is you can't just, the props aren't as easy to deal with. But pen.